The cheetah's amber eyes held the same shade as his dead son's, a detail that stopped Thomas Mitchell cold in the scorching African sun. She lay collapsed in the golden grass, ribs cutting sharp shadows across her spotted coat, breath coming in desperate gasps that echoed another helpless moment 3 years ago. "Not again," Thomas whispered, his knees hitting the red earth. "Please, God, not again." Behind him, the tour vehicles growled away in clouds of dust, leaving him alone with death once more. But this time was different. This time, the dying creature lifted one trembling paw toward him, not in fear, but in trust so absolute it shattered something frozen inside his chest. The farewell letter in his pocket weighed heavier than the water bottles. He'd come to Kenya to end his story, not begin another. Yet here she was, fighting for breath, fighting for something beyond herself. And suddenly, so was he. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. Thomas Mitchell had spent 30 years saving lives in his veterinary practice in Whitefish, Montana. Now, at 62, he couldn't save himself from drowning in memories. 3 years ago, his son James had fallen from a cliff face on Glacier National Park, his final cry of "Dad" echoing through mountain valleys and Thomas's nightmares ever since. Eleanor, his wife of 35 years, had followed James just 1 year later. Cancer, the doctors said. But Thomas knew better. She'd died of a broken heart, leaving him alone in a house that groaned with ghosts. The Masai Mara stretched before him now, endless golden grass beneath an unforgiving sun, as different from Montana's pine-covered mountains as life was from death. He'd sold his practice, given away belongings that once mattered, and joined Healing Heart's wildlife tours with 8 other retirees seeking meaning in their sunset years. They didn't know about the farewell letter folded in his shirt pocket or Eleanor's sleeping pills hidden in his camera bag. This wasn't a vacation. It was his final journey. Margaret Chen, their tour leader, was a retired nurse from San Francisco who watched him with knowing eyes. She'd seen grief before, could recognize its weight in the slope of shoulders and the emptiness of smiles. Robert "Bobby" Hayes, a loud Texan rancher, filled every silence with stories about his cattle empire, his philosophy simple: nature knows best, humans just mess things up. Sarah Williams, a soft-spoken widow from Vermont, sat beside Thomas at meals, never pushing conversation but offering the comfort of understanding silence. The tour group treated Africa like a photography exhibit, snapping pictures, exclaiming over elephants, checking experiences off bucket lists. Thomas moved through it all mechanically, his body present while his mind counted down to the night he'd chosen. 5 more days until the group reached Nairobi. 5 more days until he could slip away and finally rest. But the savannah had other plans, even in his numbness. Something stirred when they'd stopped that afternoon. The distressed chirping of birds, the lazy circle of vultures, the way the wind carried a scent of struggle and defeat. His veterinarian instincts, buried beneath layers of grief, flickered to life. He'd wandered from the group, drawn by some invisible thread toward the acacia tree where she lay dying. Now, standing over the cheetah, Thomas felt the first crack in his carefully constructed armor of indifference. The tour vehicle lurched to a stop, and Margaret's voice rang out with practiced enthusiasm. "Photo opportunity. Everyone acacia trees and the perfect afternoon light." The others scrambled for cameras, but Thomas barely heard her. Something pulled at him, not Margaret's voice, not the excited chatter of his fellow tourists, but something primitive and urgent in the air itself. Vultures circled lazily against the burnished sky, their shadows crossing the ground like dark omens. Thomas found himself walking away from the group, his boots crunching through dry grass that whispered secrets with each step. Behind him, Bobby Hayes was lecturing someone about cattle prices. But the voice faded as Thomas moved toward a cluster of thorn bushes where the vultures seemed most interested. "Thomas," Margaret called. "Stay with the group." He waved vaguely without turning, pulled forward by 30 years of responding to distress signals he'd learned to read in countless animals. The scent hit him first: blood, Yes, but also something else. Milk, fear, desperation. She lay beneath an umbrella acacia, her spotted coat dulled with dust and deprivation. The cheetah's breathing came in shallow, rapid pants that spoke of pain beyond exhaustion. Her hip jutted at an angle that made Thomas's veterinary mind catalog immediately displacement. Possible fracture, certainly trauma, but it was her eyes that held him amber, conscious, and utterly devoid of the wild fear he expected. Thomas dropped to his knees 3 feet away, his hands automatically moving in the slow, non-threatening gestures he'd perfected over decades. "Hey there, Mama," he whispered, his voice cracking on words he hadn't spoken to an animal since Eleanor died. "What happened to you?" The cheetah's tail twitched not in aggression, but acknowledgement. She tried to lift her head, failed, and let out a sound that wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a cry. Thomas's trained eye swept over her form, protruding ribs spoke of weeks without successful hunts. The swollen mammary glands confirmed she was nursing, and those wounds on her hip, those weren't from a failed kill. Those were defensive wounds, the kind that came from fighting off something while protecting something else. "Dear God," Thomas breathed, understanding flooding through him. "Where are your babies?" The cheetah's eyes flickered toward a dense thicket 20 yards away. She tried to drag herself forward, her front claws finding no purchase in the dust, her back legs useless from the hip injury. The effort cost her everything. She collapsed with a soft exhale that Thomas felt in his chest. He was moving before conscious thought engaged, approaching the thorn bush with careful steps. The chirping hit him first high, desperate, the universal sound of young things calling for their mother. Parting the thorny branches carefully, Thomas found them 2 cubs, perhaps 3 months old, their oversized paws and ears making them look like stuffed toys rather than apex predators. They were weak but alive, pressed against each other in the shade, their small bodies trembling. "Thomas Mitchell, you get back here right now." Margaret's voice carried across the savannah, sharp with authority and concern. He backed out of the thicket to find the entire tour group had followed, standing in a semicircle like some bizarre intervention. Margaret's face was flushed, her hands on her hips. Bobby Hayes looked disgusted, Sarah Williams worried, and the others simply confused. "She's dying," Thomas said simply. "She has cubs. That's nature, Doc," Bobby spat, using the title like an insult. "Natural selection. The weak die so the strong survive. That's how it's always been." "She's not weak," Thomas shot back, surprising himself with the vehemence. "She's injured protecting her cubs." "There's a difference." "You can't save every animal, Thomas," Margaret said, her voice gentler now. She knew his history. He'd filled out the tour forms honestly, citing recent loss of spouse as his reason for travel. "We need to get back to camp before dark." "Then go." The words came out flat, final. Thomas pulled his return ticket from his pocket, the one that would take him from Nairobi to Montana, the ticket he'd never planned to use anyway. He held it out to Margaret. "I'm staying." The group erupted. Bobby's voice rose above the rest. "You're going to die out here, you damn fool, for what? For an animal that would eat you if she could. Playing God won't bring back your boy." The words hit like physical blows. Thomas's hand clenched around the ticket, crumpling it. "No," he said quietly, "but walking away will surely finish killing me." Silence fell over the group. Sarah Williams stepped forward first, pulling water bottles from her pack. "He'll need these," she said simply to Margaret. Then to Thomas. "My husband would have done the same thing." Margaret studied him for a long moment, then sighed. She opened her medical kit, the comprehensive one she always carried, and began pulling out supplies. Antibiotics, bandages, antiseptic, even a small surgical kit. "You have 3 days of water if you're careful," she said briskly. "I'll be back with the supply run in 2 days. If you're not here, or if you're—" She didn't finish. "I'll be here," Thomas said. Bobby threw his hands up in disgust. "Damn bleeding hearts. All of you." But as he turned to leave, he pulled something from his own pack, a bottle of veterinary-grade antibiotics. "From my ranch kit," he muttered, shoving it at Thomas. Don't say I never did nothing. Sarah pressed something into his hand, her satellite phone. For emergencies, she whispered. Or just to talk. They left him there as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, their vehicle disappearing into the distance. Thomas watched until the dust settled, then turned back to the cheetah. For the first time in a year, his hands moved with purpose as he emptied his pack. Out came the farewell letter, Eleanor's sleeping pills, the weight of planned ending. In went water bottles, medical supplies, energy bars. He kept the letter for a moment, reading his own handwriting. I have nothing left to give. Then he tore it into strips, stuffing them in his pocket for kindling. The cheetah watched him approach with those amber eyes, James's eyes, and Thomas felt something shift inside his chest. Not healing, not yet, but the possibility of it. The suggestion that perhaps ending and beginning could exist in the same moment. The same choice. The same act of staying when every instinct said to go. All right, Mama, he said, settling beside her with the medical supplies. Let's see what we can do. The African night descended with startling swiftness, transforming the savannah into a landscape of shadows and sounds. Thomas built a small fire from dried grass and the torn pieces of his farewell letter. The irony not lost on him that his planned ending was now keeping them alive. The flames cast dancing light across the cheetah's spotted coat as he knelt beside her with Margaret's medical supplies spread on a cloth. Working by firelight. Thomas's trained hands moved with forgotten confidence, cleaning wounds with careful precision. It was when he examined the deep punctures on her hip that everything changed. The bite pattern was distinctive, 4 canines in a specific spread that his years of experience immediately recognized. Spotted hyenas. But these weren't the wounds of a failed hunt or a fight over a carcass. The angle, the depth, the defensive scratches surrounding them, they told a different story entirely. You weren't hunting, Thomas murmured, his fingers gentle as they probed the injury. You were running, leading them away from something. His eyes moved to the thorn bush where the cubs remained hidden. You let them catch you to save your babies. The cheetah's eyes followed his movements, and when his hand approached her head, she didn't flinch. This went against every instinct she possessed. Cheetahs were notoriously skittish, even in captivity. Yet she allowed his touch, perhaps recognizing a fellow parent who understood sacrifice. Thomas prepared an injection of antibiotics, diluting Bobby's veterinary-grade medicine with practiced ease. This might sting, he warned, though he knew she couldn't understand. But when the needle went in, she merely blinked, her trust absolute and devastating. The cubs had been crying steadily since sunset, their high-pitched chirps carrying across the darkness. Thomas knew he needed to address their hunger, but the mother needed treatment first. He worked methodically, cleaning, disinfecting, bandaging what he could. The hip injury was beyond his field capabilities, but he could manage pain and fight infection. It was near midnight when he finally approached the cubs with water and small pieces of energy bar soaked until soft. They hissed at first, tiny fierce things trying to be brave, but hunger won. The bolder one, slightly larger, with a distinctive tear mark that curved like a smile, crept forward first. Thomas held perfectly still as the cub sniffed his fingers, then began to lick the moistened food. That's it, little one, Thomas whispered. I'm not your mama, but I'm trying. The second cub, smaller and more cautious, watched her sibling eat before hunger drove her forward too. Thomas fed them slowly, carefully, knowing too much too fast could harm them. When they'd eaten what little he dared give, they retreated to their bush, but not as far as before. Returning to the mother, Thomas found her watching the cubs with an intensity that transcended species. She'd managed to drag herself 2 feet closer to them while he was gone, leaving a trail of disturbed earth that spoke of enormous effort. When Thomas offered her water from his cupped palm, she drank. But when he presented food, she turned her head toward the cubs. You need to eat too, Thomas said, but she pushed the food away with her nose, a gesture so deliberate it made his throat constrict. Eleanor had done the same thing, Those last weeks, when the cancer consumed her from within, she'd pushed her untouched plates toward him. "You need your strength, Tom," she'd say, even as she withered away. "You still have things to do." He'd argued then, tried to force her to eat, not understanding that sometimes love meant accepting the unbearable gift of someone else's sacrifice. The cheetah mother made a soft chirping sound, different from the cub's cries, lower, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby. The cubs responded immediately, their own chirps quieting. Thomas recognized it as the contact call mothers use to reassure their young, and his eyes burned with sudden tears. "I know," he said, his voice rough. "I know what you're doing. You're telling them it's okay, aren't you, just like Eleanor told me?" He settled against the acacia tree, positioned between the mother and her cubs, maintaining the fire to ward off whatever might come in the night. The cheetah watched him for a long moment, then did something extraordinary. She dragged herself closer, closing the distance until her shoulder touched his leg. The contact was light, barely there, but it was trust incarnate. Thomas dozed fitfully, jerking awake each time the fire dimmed or a sound punctured the night. Somewhere near dawn, exhaustion finally claimed him completely. The dream came immediately, vivid as memory. James stood at the edge of a cliff, not the one where he'd fallen, but somewhere beautiful and impossible, where Montana mountains met African plains. His son looked whole, healthy, his amber eyes bright with that enthusiasm that had always made him seem younger than his 28 years. "Dad," James said, and his voice was exactly as Thomas remembered, warm, slightly teasing, full of life. "Dad, help them." "I couldn't help you," Thomas said, the dream logic allowing him to speak his greatest failure. "I wasn't there. I couldn't save you." "I didn't need saving," James replied. And suddenly Eleanor was there too, her hand in James's, both of them glowing with something beyond health. "But they do. Help them live, Dad. That's all any of us can do, help each other live." Thomas woke to find the cheetah mother's head resting on his lap, her eyes open and watching him in the pre-dawn light. The moon hung low, casting silver across the savanna, and in that ethereal glow, her amber eyes were exactly the shade of James's, not similar, not close, but identical in a way that defied rational explanation. His hand moved to stroke her head, and she allowed it, even leaned into the touch slightly. The cubs had crept closer during the night, now only 10 feet away, their eyes reflecting the dying firelight like tiny stars. Thomas pulled out the crumpled remains of his farewell letter, the few pieces he'd saved for morning kindling. By moonlight, he could still read fragments of his own handwriting, nothing left to give, no purpose remaining. Better to end with dignity than continue without meaning. "Lies," he whispered to the cheetah. "All lies." He had everything to give, his knowledge, his experience, his ability to help. The cheetah mother had fought hyenas with a broken hip to save her cubs. Eleanor had endured agony to squeeze out every last moment with her family. James had lived with explosive joy despite knowing mountains were dangerous. And here Thomas sat, healthy and whole, convinced he had nothing to offer. He fed the rest of the letter to the renewed fire, watching his planned ending turn to ash and smoke. Then he pulled out Sarah's satellite phone and dialed Margaret's number. She answered on the second ring, despite the early hour. "Thomas, are you all right?" "I need supplies," he said without preamble. "Proper veterinary equipment, antibiotics, milk replacement formula for cheetah cubs. I need documentation equipment too, cameras, notebooks. This mother's behavior is extraordinary. It needs to be recorded." "Thomas, that could cost—" "I'll pay. I'll sell my house if I have to." "Margaret, she deliberately sacrificed herself to predators to save her cubs. She's trusting me, a human, completely. This could change how we understand cheetah behavior, their capacity for reasoning, for love. There was silence on the line, then Margaret's voice, warm with something like approval. The Conservation Fund has emergency resources. If you're documenting, if this could help the species, it could, it will. 2 days. Thomas, I'll be there with everything in 2 days. Keep them alive. I will, Thomas said, and meant it. For the first time in 3 years, he had a promise to keep. He ended the call and looked at the cheetah mother, her head still on his lap, her eyes still that impossible amber. We're going to make it, he told her. All of us. Somehow, we're going to make it. The sun broke the horizon, painting the savanna gold, and Thomas felt something he'd thought was gone forever: purpose. Not the purpose he'd had before: husband, father, successful vet, but something new, born from ashes and amber eyes and the weight of a dying cheetah's trust. He had 48 hours until help arrived. 48 hours to keep a mother alive and 2 cubs from starving. After 30 years of veterinary practice, after losing everything that mattered, Thomas Mitchell was back in the business of saving lives. Starting with his own. The first full day tested everything Thomas thought he knew about wild animals. The cheetah mother, he'd started thinking of her as Grace, though he knew the danger in naming wild things allowed him to clean her wounds again as the morning sun climbed. Her trust was absolute, even when he had to debride infected tissue, a procedure that must have been agony. She merely closed her eyes, her breathing steady, occasionally making that soft chirping sound toward her cubs. The cubs presented a different challenge. They needed milk, but Thomas only had powdered energy drinks and water. He mixed a weak solution, knowing it was inadequate but better than starvation. The bolder cub, the one with the curved tear mark, crept forward when he set the makeshift bowl between them and their mother. After a tentative taste, she began to lap eagerly. Her sister held back until hunger won over fear. "That's it, little ones," Thomas murmured, keeping his movements slow. "Not exactly mother's milk, but we'll make do until help arrives." Grace watched this interaction with an intensity that seemed almost human. When the cubs finished drinking, she made a specific sound, a short, sharp chirp, and both cubs immediately returned to their hiding spot. She was still teaching them, even dying. By noon, the African sun had become brutal. Thomas rigged a shade shelter using his jacket and branches, positioning it to protect Grace from the worst of the heat. He'd learned to read her needs the way her eyes tracked the cubs when they needed checking, how her breathing changed when she needed water, the subtle tension that meant predators were near. It was late afternoon when he heard the distinctive whoop of spotted hyenas. 3 of them emerged from the tall grass, their sloped backs and powerful jaws marking them as the apex scavengers of the savanna. They'd likely been tracking Grace's weakness for days. Thomas stood, placing himself between the hyenas and Grace. His hand found the knife in his belt, pathetically inadequate, but all he had. "Not today," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Not on my watch." The lead hyena tested him, darting forward, then back, trying to trigger a prey response. Thomas held his ground, remembering advice from a long-ago documentary: never run from a hyena. He picked up a rock, threw it hard, hitting the leader in the shoulder. It yelped, more surprised than hurt. "Go on!" Thomas shouted, waving his arms. "Get out of here!" They circled for 20 minutes, looking for weakness, but Thomas maintained his position. Finally, perhaps deciding he was too much trouble for an uncertain meal, they melted back into the grass. Grace had watched the entire encounter, and when Thomas turned back to her, she did something extraordinary. She reached out with one paw and touched his leg, just briefly, a gesture of acknowledgement. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire, Grace's head again on his lap, and found himself talking. The words poured out stories he hadn't told anyone since Eleanor died. "James wanted to be a wildlife photographer," he said softly, stroking Grace's head. "He had your eyes, you know, that exact shade of amber. Eleanor always said he got them from her father, but I'd never seen anyone else with eyes quite like that until you—" Grace listened, her breathing steady under his hand. He was climbing in Glacier to get a photo of mountain goats. "Early morning, best light," he said. The ledge gave way. "They said he died instantly, but I always wondered if he had a moment. You know, a moment to be afraid, to call for help that couldn't come. The cheetah made a soft sound. Not quite a purr, cheetahs rarely purred, but something close. Eleanor blamed herself for encouraging his photography. I blamed myself for teaching him to climb. We tore ourselves apart with guilt until the cancer came. Then we only had energy for dying. A cub chirped from the bushes, and Grace responded with that maternal reassurance call. Thomas marveled at the parallel even in her extremity. Her focus remained on her young. Day 2 brought unexpected help. A Maasai elder appeared at midday, walking with the measured pace of someone who belonged to the land. He was tall, dignified, wrapped in traditional red cloth, his face a map of years under the sun. "I am Joseph," he said in accented English. "The tour woman, Margaret. She sent word. You help the Duma." He used the Swahili word for cheetah. Joseph had brought gifts: fresh goat milk in a traditional gourd, herbs he said would help with infection, and most surprisingly, understanding. "The Duma, she is good mother," Joseph said, squatting beside Grace with no fear. "We see her before. 3 seasons now. She hunts near our village. Never takes goats. Only wild prey. We call her Malkia Queen for how she walks." "She's dying," Thomas said bluntly. Joseph nodded. "All things die. But first, they live. You help her live last days with dignity. This is good." He showed Thomas how to mix the herbs into a paste for Grace's wounds, how to thin the goat milk properly for the cubs. Before leaving, he pressed a small carved wooden cheetah into Thomas's hand. "For protection," he said simply. That evening, Thomas's satellite phone rang. Sarah Williams' voice was excited. "Thomas, I've started a fundraising page online. The story, an American vet saving a cheetah family, it's going viral. We've raised $8,000 in 6 hours. I don't need. It's not for you. It's for them. For medical supplies, formula, future care. People want to help. Thomas, let them." After the call, Thomas sat in wonder. Strangers around the world, caring about one dying cheetah and her cubs in Kenya. Grace seemed to sense his emotion, nuzzling his hand with her head. The cubs were growing bolder. Thomas had started what he privately called hunting lessons. Though it violated every principle of wildlife non-interference, he would drag a strip of cloth on a string, letting them stalk and pounce. The female with the curved tear-mark Hope, he'd decided was a natural, her sister. Smaller and more cautious, Chance learned by watching. Grace observed these sessions with intense interest. Despite her weakness, she began making instructional sounds, different chirps that seemed to guide the cub's behavior. When Hope successfully killed Thomas's cap, Grace made a sound Thomas had never heard from a cheetah, a deep, rumbling purr. "You did purr." Thomas actually laughed for the first time in 3 years. "The textbooks say you don't, but you just did." He was documenting everything in a notebook Margaret had left. Behavioral observations that challenged established cheetah science, the deliberate sacrifice to predators, the trust of humans, the complex vocal communications, the teaching despite mortal injury. His sketches filled pages. Grace's facial expressions, the cubs' play positions, the family's sleeping arrangements. On the morning of day 3, Bobby Hayes arrived with the supply convoy. Thomas barely recognized the Texan rancher without his usual bluster. Bobby unloaded boxes, silently veterinary supplies, specialized cheetah formula, even a small refrigeration unit powered by solar batteries. "Don't make a big deal of it," Bobby muttered when Thomas tried to thank him. "I still think you're a damn fool. But my wife saw that fundraising page, told me about your boy. I lost a son too. Car accident, 15 years back. Different, but the same." He paused at his vehicle, looking back. "The cheetah knows she's dying. Doc, animals always know. But she's choosing to trust you with her cubs. That means something." After Bobby left, Thomas had proper supplies to work with. He set up an IV drip for Grace, hydrating her properly for the first time. The specialized formula transformed the cubs within hours. They were more energetic, their coats brightening. But Grace wouldn't eat, despite Thomas's increasingly desperate attempts. She would take water, accept medication, but food she consistently pushed toward the cubs with her nose. It was deliberate, reasoned, heartbreaking. Thomas remembered Eleanor's last days, how she'd said, "Every bite I take is one less for you to remember me by. Let me go, Tom. But first, help me see you'll be okay." That afternoon, Grace did something that shattered Thomas's scientific objectivity. She began to teach the cubs seriously, despite barely being able to move. She demonstrated the killing bite on a piece of meat Thomas offered, showing them the precise neck grip cheetahs used. When Hope mimicked it successfully, Grace purring again. That deep rumble that wasn't supposed to exist. As the sun set on day 3, Thomas made a decision that would have horrified his veterinary professors. He brought the cubs to Grace, placing them against her belly where they could nurse, even though she had little milk left. The reunion was profound, the cubs' joy, Grace's contentment despite her pain. "I know this is wrong," Thomas said to Grace, his hand on her head. "I'm interfering, creating bonds that shouldn't exist. But you're rewriting the rules anyway, aren't you?" That night, with the cubs curled against their mother and Thomas keeping watch, he sang. It felt foolish at first, but Grace seemed to relax at the sound. He sang Amazing Grace, the hymn Eleanor had loved, the one they'd played at both funerals. His voice cracked, but he continued, and somewhere in the second verse, Grace's purr joined the melody. The satellite phone buzzed with messages. Sarah sent updates on the fundraising, now over $50,000. Margaret confirmed a rescue team would arrive tomorrow with Dr. Patricia Foster, one of the world's leading cheetah specialists. Even Bobby sent a terse message, praying for you all. Don't you dare let them die. But Thomas knew what Grace knew. He could see it in how she looked at her cubs, memorizing them. How she pressed her scent into their fur with increasing urgency. How she'd started refusing even water, her body beginning its final shutdown. "One more day," Thomas whispered to her as the cubs slept. "Just give me one more day." Grace looked at him with those amber eyes, James's eyes, and Thomas understood she wasn't holding on for herself anymore. She was holding on for him, making sure he was ready for what came next, teaching him, as she taught her cubs, that love meant knowing when to hold tight and when to let go. That night, Thomas documented something no scientific journal would ever publish. Grace positioned her cubs in a specific pattern against her belly, the same way Eleanor had arranged family photos on her hospital bed. She placed one paw over Thomas's chest, directly over his heart where he kept the photo of his family. Then she made a sound he'd never heard before. Couldn't categorize or classify a sound that might have been Tommy, James's nickname for him, though that was impossible. Impossible. But so was a wild cheetah trusting a human completely. So was surviving this long with her injuries. So was Thomas finding purpose in his deepest despair. He didn't write this observation in his official notes. Some truths were too large for science, too profound for documentation. Some things could only be believed by those who'd experienced them the moment when the universe revealed its hidden connections, when loss and love became the same thing. When a dying cheetah in Kenya could carry messages from a family in Montana, Margaret would arrive tomorrow with the rescue team. Decisions would be made about the cubs' future. Grace's time was measured in hours now, not days. But tonight, under the vast African sky, a broken man and a dying cheetah had created something extraordinary, a bridge between species, between worlds, between the living and the lost. The cubs stirred in their sleep, making small hunting movements, dreaming of the future their mother was purchasing with her life. Thomas kept his hand on Grace's head, singing softly, holding vigil. He'd held this same vigil for Eleanor, for James in absentia. But this time, he wasn't just watching death approach. This time, he was learning that sometimes the greatest act of love was simply being present for the transition, witnessing the handoff of life from one generation to the next, understanding that endings and beginnings were not opposites, but dance partners in the endless spiral of existence. Tomorrow would bring helicopters and experts and decisions, but tonight there was just this: a man, a cheetah, two cubs, and the stars bearing witness to love that transcended explanation. Dawn came violently on the fifth day. Thomas woke to Grace's body convulsing, her legs rigid, her head thrown back in a seizure that sent the cubs scattering in terror. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands automatically moving to protect her head from striking the ground, feeling the tremors rack through her depleted frame. No, 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 he breathed, recognizing the signs immediately. The infection had gone systemic sepsis, spreading through her bloodstream despite the antibiotics. Her body temperature spiked under his hands, and when the seizure finally passed after an endless minute, she lay panting, her amber eyes unfocused. Thomas grabbed the satellite phone, hands shaking as he dialed Margaret. "I need that rescue team now. She's going into septic shock." "They're already in the air." Margaret's voice crackled through static. 40 minutes out. Patricia Foster is with them. Full surgical setup. 40 minutes. It might as well have been 40 hours. Thomas looked at his limited supplies: basic antibiotics, IV fluids, pain medication, nothing that could stop what was happening inside Grace's body. But he'd been a vet for 30 years. He'd performed emergency surgeries in barn stalls, on kitchen tables, in the back of pickup trucks. He laid out his supplies on a clean cloth, the small surgical kit Margaret had left, barely adequate for field sutures. Sterilized his knife over the fire. His hands shook as he prepared a local anesthetic, knowing it wasn't enough. Knowing what he was about to attempt was beyond reckless. "I'm sorry," he whispered to Grace, whose eyes had cleared enough to watch him. "This is going to hurt, but I have to try." The abscess was where he'd suspected, deep in the muscle tissue near the hyena bite. As he made the first incision, Grace's body tensed, but she didn't fight. Even now, even in agony, she trusted him completely. Thomas worked with desperate precision, draining the infected fluid, flushing the wound with every antibiotic he had left. The cubs watched from their hiding spot, making distressed, chirping sounds. Grace, despite her pain, responded with that maternal reassurance call between gasps. She was still mothering, still teaching them to be brave. Blood covered Thomas's hands, too much blood. He'd nicked something, couldn't see what in the crude conditions. He pressed gauze to the wound, applied pressure, prayed to a god he'd stopped believing in when James fell. "Please," he said, not sure if he was talking to Grace or the universe. "Just hold on." The helicopter's sound reached them before the dust cloud did. It landed 50 yards away, and Patricia Foster emerged like an angel of efficiency: short gray hair, weathered face, movements that spoke of decades in the field. Her team followed with equipment that made Thomas's efforts look medieval. Thomas Mitchell. She didn't wait for confirmation, already kneeling beside Grace, her trained hands assessing. "Margaret told me about you. Said you've documented unprecedented behavior." "She's septic," Thomas said unnecessarily. "I tried to drain the abscess, but—" "You did well." Patricia cut him off. Already working. Her team set up a field surgical station with practice speed sterile barriers, monitoring equipment, proper surgical tools. Most vets couldn't have kept her alive this long with these injuries. As Patricia worked, she fired questions. "The trust behavior, when did it start, Faye?" "Immediately," Thomas said, holding Grace's head as the team prepared her for surgery. "No aggression, even when I first approached. And the cubs, she's allowed you near them. She's been teaching them to trust me. It's deliberate, calculated. She knows she's dying." Patricia's hands paused for just a moment. "Animals don't—" "This one does," Thomas said firmly. "I've documented everything. The vocalization patterns alone will revolutionize cheetah behavioral science." The surgery took 2 hours. Thomas stayed at Grace's head throughout, singing Amazing Grace when she showed distress, the melody seeming to calm her even under sedation. The cubs had crept closer, drawn by their mother's vulnerability, or perhaps by Thomas's voice. Patricia worked with extraordinary skill, removing necrotic tissue, repairing internal damage Thomas could never have managed. "She's fought harder than any animal I've seen," she murmured. "The damage should have killed her days ago." "She had reasons to live," Thomas said, his eyes on the cubs. As the sun reached its zenith, Patricia finally stepped back. "I've done what I can. The next hours will tell." She looked at Thomas with professional curiosity. "Margaret said you were grieving, lost family recently. My son 3 years ago, my wife last year, and you came to Kenya too." Thomas reached into his pocket, pulled out Eleanor's pills, handed them to Patricia. "To end things. Had it all planned. Then I found her." Patricia studied the pills. Then him. Then Grace. "And now I have promises to keep." The afternoon was a vigil. Grace's breathing was shallow but steady. The monitors the team had attached showing weak but consistent vital signs. Patricia's team had set up a full field station, but they gave Thomas space, recognizing something beyond veterinary science was happening here. It was near sunset when Grace woke fully. Her eyes found Thomas first, then tracked to her cubs, who were now bold enough to approach despite the strangers. Patricia watched in amazement as Grace made a specific chirp, and both cubs immediately came to her, curling against her belly. "That's trained behavior," Patricia breathed. "She's taught them voice commands." "She's taught them more than that," Thomas said. What happened next defied every scientific principle Thomas had learned in 30 years. Grace began arranging her cubs with deliberate movements, positioning them against her body in a specific pattern. She moved slowly, precisely, despite her weakness, until Hope was curved against her left side and Chance pressed to her right. "My God," Thomas whispered. It was exactly how Eleanor had arranged the family photos on her hospital bed the night before she died. James on the left, Thomas on the right, herself in the middle. The same precise positioning. Grace looked at him, those amber eyes holding knowledge that shouldn't exist. Then extended her paw to rest on his chest. Not his hand, not his leg, but directly over his heart where the bulge of his family photo was visible in his shirt pocket. "That's not possible," Patricia said, but her scientific skepticism was cracking. Grace made a sound then, not a chirp, not a growl, something Thomas had never heard from any animal. It was 2 syllables, almost articulated, impossibly close to Tommy, the name only James had ever called him. Thomas's vision blurred with tears. "I hear you," he said, not caring how insane it sounded. "I understand." Patricia moved closer, her scientific mind warring with what she was witnessing. "The vocalization, could you replicate it?" Grace made the sound again, clearer this time, and even Patricia stepped back. It wasn't mimicry. Cheetahs didn't have the vocal structure for that. It was something else, something that existed in the space between science and faith. "Document everything," Patricia said to her team, her voice shaking slightly. "Every second of this." The vigil continued as darkness fell. Grace was fading, everyone could see it. Her body had given everything it had and more, but she remained conscious, alert, her eyes moving between her cubs and Thomas with deliberate purpose. Thomas found himself talking, the words flowing without thought. "They'll be safe," he promised her, both of them. "There's a sanctuary in Spain that will take them. Keep them together. They'll never want for anything." Grace's eyes held his, and he continued. "I was going to die here. Had it all planned. But you showed me something I'd forgotten, that love doesn't end with death. It transforms, continues, finds new vessels." He touched her head gently. "James sent me to find you. Didn't he, or you to find me? Either way, the message is received." Patricia's team watched in silent respect as this communion between species unfolded. One of them was recording, but the camera seemed almost irreverent in the face of such profound connection. "I need to tell you something," Thomas said to Grace, leaning closer. "What you're doing, sacrificing yourself for your cubs, my wife did the same thing. refused treatment that might have given her more time because she wanted to leave more resources for me. I was so angry at her for that choice. But now I understand. It wasn't giving up. It was giving forward. Grace's purr, that impossible purr that shouldn't exist, rumbled through the night air. The cubs pressed closer to her, and she cleaned their faces with slow, deliberate strokes of her tongue, marking them with her scent one last time. "Dr. Mitchell," Patricia said softly. When had she learned his title? Her organs are failing. We could try more aggressive intervention, but... "No," Thomas said firmly. "No more pain. She's earned peace." He settled beside Grace, her head in his lap as it had been each night, but this time surrounded by witnesses to something extraordinary. The conservation team, hardened by years of wildlife tragedy, stood in a respectful circle. Patricia had tears on her weathered face. Thomas began to sing again. "Amazing Grace," his voice stronger now. One of Patricia's team, a young woman from South Africa, joined in, harmonizing. Then another voice, and another, until the ancient hymn rose over the savannah, a human chorus for a dying cheetah who had somehow bridged the infinite space between species. Grace's breathing grew shallower, but her eyes remained alert, moving between Thomas and her cubs. She made one more sound clearly, distinctly, impossibly, Tommy. Even the skeptics heard it this time. "I'll remember," Thomas promised. "Everything. I'll make sure the world knows what you did, what you were. Not just a cheetah, a mother, a teacher, a savior." The stars emerged overhead, brilliant in the African sky. The same stars that had shone over Montana when James died, when Eleanor passed. The same stars that would shine over Spain, where hope and chance would grow strong. Connection across distance, across time, across the veil between life and whatever came after. Patricia knelt beside them, her scientific demeanor completely abandoned. "In 40 years of working with cheetahs," she said softly, "I've never seen anything like this. This will change everything we think we know about animal consciousness, about their capacity for complex emotion and reasoning." "She's not just an animal," Thomas said. "She never was." As if in agreement, Grace lifted her head one final time, looking at each cub in turn, then at Thomas. Her amber eyes, James's eyes, held perfect clarity for one moment. Then she laid her head back on Thomas's lap and let out a long, slow breath. She didn't close her eyes. Like Eleanor, like Thomas imagined James had done, she faced the transition with open awareness. Her body relaxed, the pain finally leaving her face, but her eyes stayed on Thomas until the very end, as if making sure he understood the message she'd been sent to deliver. The silence that followed was profound. Even the nocturnal sounds of the savannah seemed to pause in respect. The cubs made questioning chirps, nosing their mother's still form, but somehow they seemed to understand too. They pressed against Thomas instead, seeking comfort from the one their mother had chosen. "Time of death," Patricia said, her voice professional but thick with emotion. 8:47 p.m. She looked at Thomas. "Do you want us to?" "No," Thomas said. "Tomorrow, tonight, we hold vigil. It's what she deserves." The team settled around them, keeping watch. Someone built up the fire. Stories were shared, other remarkable animals they'd known, other moments when science failed to explain what the heart understood. Thomas told them about James, about Eleanor, about how he'd come to Kenya to die but found a reason to live in the eyes of a dying cheetah. The cubs slept against him, their small bodies warm and trusting. Grace lay beside them, her body at peace, her mission complete. And Thomas Mitchell, who had thought his story was over, realized it was just beginning a new chapter, one written in the language of loss and redemption, of endings that were really transformations, of love that transcended every boundary humans tried to erect between themselves and the wild. The African night held them in a sacred silence after Grace's passing. Thomas remained still, her head on his lap. The cubs pressed against his sides, their small bodies trembling with confusion. The conservation team maintained a respectful distance around the fire, understanding they were witnessing something beyond scientific observation, a threshold moment where grief and grace intertwined. Hope, the bolder cub, was the first to understand. She nosed her mother's still face, making the contact call Grace had taught her. When no response came, she made it again, louder, more insistent. Chance joined her sister, both cubs chirping with increasing desperation. The sound cut through Thomas like shards of memory, James calling for help that couldn't come, Eleanor whispering his name in her final moments. "She's gone," Thomas said softly to the cubs, though he knew they couldn't understand words. But perhaps they understood tone, understood the tears that finally came, 3 years of unshed grief breaking like a dam. He cried for James, whose love of nature had led him to that fatal cliff. He cried for Eleanor, who had died of a broken heart disguised as cancer. He cried for Grace, who had given everything for her children. But mostly, he cried for himself, for the man he'd been, the father who'd failed, the husband who'd survived when he shouldn't have. The cubs responded to his grief in the way of wild things with presence, not comfort. They didn't try to make it better. They simply existed beside him, their warmth a reminder that life continued even in death's shadow. Hope eventually settled with her head on his knee, while Chance burrowed against his ribs, and Thomas understood this was Grace's final gift, not just trusting him with her cubs, but giving him reason to continue when continuation seemed impossible. Patricia Foster approached after an hour, kneeling beside them with practiced gentleness. "Thomas, we need to discuss arrangements. The body." "Can't we bury her?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. "This is the Mara," Patricia said gently. "She's part of the ecosystem. Hyenas, vultures, jackals, they all depend on what she leaves behind. It's the circle of life. Not cruel, but necessary." Thomas's Western sensibilities recoiled. In Montana, they'd buried their pets in the backyard, marked their graves with stones and flowers. Eleanor had been cremated, her ashes scattered in her garden. James's body had been recovered from the mountain, given a proper funeral with hymns and eulogies. But Grace wasn't his to claim, wasn't his to protect from nature's recycling. "The Maasai understand this." Joseph's voice came from the darkness. The elder had arrived silently, drawn by news of Grace's condition. "The body feeds the earth. The spirit runs free. This is the way." Thomas looked at the cubs, who had finally stopped calling for their mother and lay exhausted against him. "They need to see this. To understand. They already understand," Joseph said. "Young ones know death before they know words for it. What they need to know is that death has not taken you too." The truth of it hit Thomas like a physical blow. That's exactly what had happened when James died. Death had taken Thomas too, just left his body walking around. Eleanor had known it, had died watching her husband fade away even as he sat beside her bed. But these cubs needed him present, needed him alive, needed him to choose them over the seductive pull of joining Grace in whatever came after. "We'll move her at dawn," Patricia said. "Away from the cubs, but not far. They need to be able to find her if they search, to understand she didn't abandon them." The night stretched endless. Thomas sat vigil as he had for Eleanor, but this time he wasn't alone. The conservation team took turns tending the fire, sharing stories, creating a human circle around grief. Someone produced a flask of whiskey that made the rounds. Someone else sang a Swahili lullaby that made the cubs' ears twitch in sleep. "Tell us about your son," Patricia said during the darkest hour before dawn. Thomas found himself talking, really talking, for the first time since the funeral, about James's laugh that could fill a room, his terrible cooking but insistence on trying anyway, the way he'd approach every animal without fear, convinced all creatures were fundamentally good, his dreams of documenting wildlife, of showing the world what Thomas was now seeing, that animals were not other but kin. "He would have loved this," Thomas said, gesturing to the cubs sleeping trustingly against him. Would have seen it as proof of everything he believed about connection between species. Maybe he did see it, Patricia said quietly. Maybe that's why you're here. Dawn came pale and hesitant, as if even the sun was reluctant to illuminate this new reality. The cubs woke slowly, immediately looking for their mother. Grace lay stiff now, her body no longer holding even the semblance of life. Hope approached her, sniffed, then backed away with a sound Thomas had never heard, something between a whine and a growl. The cheetah equivalent of no. Joseph and two other Maasai men helped move Grace's body 50 yards away, to a small rise where the scavengers would find her easily. Thomas wanted to protest, wanted to dig a grave with his bare hands, but he held the cubs instead, feeling their confusion and fear. "This is her gift to the land," Joseph said solemnly, "as the land was her gift to you." Within an hour, the vultures began to circle. The cubs watched, fascinated and disturbed, as nature began its work. Thomas fought every instinct to chase the birds away, to protect Grace's body from indignity. But was it indignity? Or just his human projection? Grace had lived by these rules, had hunted and killed and fed her cubs from other mothers' losses. This was her world's way. By noon, a spotted hyena approached, perhaps one of the same that had injured Grace initially. Thomas tensed, ready to defend even her body. But Patricia placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Let nature complete its circle," she said. "She's not there anymore. Thomas, what made her Grace is gone." The cubs seemed to understand this better than Thomas. After initial distress, they turned away from the scene, focusing instead on him, on the formula Patricia's team had prepared, on the immediate needs of survival. They were wild creatures, after all, programmed for pragmatism in the face of loss. That afternoon, as the remains of Grace disappeared into the ecosystem she'd been part of, Thomas made a decision. He sat with the cubs in the shade of the acacia tree where he'd first found their mother and spoke to them as if they could understand. "Your mother gave you to me," he said, stroking their heads as they dozed in the heat. "I don't know why. Don't understand how she knew I needed you as much as you needed me. But I promise you this, I will not fail you the way I failed my son. I will not let grief take me the way it took my wife. I will live, really live, because that's what she died to ensure." Hope looked up at him with eyes that were lighter than her mother's, more gold than amber, but holding the same impossible awareness. She made a soft chirping sound, the one Grace had used for reassurance, and Thomas felt something shift in his chest. Not healing, not yet, but the possibility of it. That evening, Patricia outlined the plan. The cubs would need weeks of rehabilitation in Kenya before they could travel. A sanctuary in Spain had agreed to take them, part of a revolutionary program to maintain cheetah genetics in semi-wild conditions. Thomas would need to stay with them. They'd imprinted on him now. Wouldn't trust another handler. "I have a house to sell in Montana," Thomas said. "A practice to formally close, papers to sign." "That can all be handled remotely," Patricia said. "The cubs need you here." Thomas looked at Hope and Chance, curled together in sleep, orphans like him, survivors like him, facing an uncertain future like him. "Then here is where I'll be." The stars emerged again, the same eternal witnesses that had watched Grace die, watched James fall, watched Eleanor fade. But tonight they also watched Thomas Mitchell choose life, choose purpose, choose to honor the dying wish of a cheetah who had somehow known exactly what he needed to save him from himself. The seventh day after Grace's death brought revelations that rewrote everything Thomas thought he understood about his presence in Kenya. It began with Patricia Foster sitting in the shade of the acacia tree, reading through his field journal with increasing excitement. "Thomas, do you realize what you've documented here?" She held up the notebook, pages filled with his observations, sketches, and detailed behavioral notes. "This vocalization pattern you've recorded, we've never seen anything like it. The deliberate sacrifice to predators, the complex communication with cubs, the trust transference to a human caregiver. This could revolutionize our understanding of cheetah cognition. Thomas looked up from where he was bottle-feeding Chance, the smaller cub having finally accepted the formula. I was just writing what I saw. That's exactly why it's valuable. You weren't trying to prove a hypothesis. You were simply observing, with 30 years of veterinary experience guiding your eye. Patricia flipped through more pages. This notation about her pushing food to the cubs while refusing to eat, you've compared it to terminal patients prioritizing their families. No one's ever made that connection in wildlife behavior studies. Before Thomas could respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle cut through the afternoon heat. A dust-covered Land Rover pulled up, and Sarah Williams climbed out, looking impossibly out of place in her Vermont cardigan despite the African setting. "Thomas," she said, slightly breathless. "I had to come. I have something to tell you that couldn't wait for a phone call." She pulled out a printed email, her hands trembling slightly. "After your story went viral on the fundraising page, someone reached out. A young woman named Emma Chen from Bozeman. She says she was James's girlfriend." Thomas felt the world tilt. James never mentioned. She explains that in the letter, they'd been dating secretly because she was his climbing student, and he didn't want you to think it was unprofessional. Thomas. Sarah paused, gathering courage. "She's pregnant. 7 months. She only found out after James died, and she didn't know how to reach you. Your phone was disconnected, the practice closed. But when she saw the story about you and the cheetah, she knew she had to try." Thomas's legs gave out. He sat hard on the ground, Chance mewing in protest at the sudden movement. Pregnant. James had a child coming into the world, a grandchild Thomas never knew existed. "There's more," Sarah said gently, sitting beside him. "She wants you in the baby's life. She's been alone, terrified, working 2 jobs to prepare. She says James talked about you constantly. How proud he was that his father saved animals. How he wanted to be like you." The cubs sensed his distress, both pressing against him with the same instinct their mother had shown. Hope pawed at the letter, leaving small dusty prints across Emma's words. "I know you're grieving. Mr. Mitchell, I am too. But this baby deserves to know their grandfather, to hear stories about their father from someone who loved him. Please, come home." Patricia had been listening quietly. Now she spoke. "Thomas, there's something else we need to discuss. The Valencia Wildlife Sanctuary in Spain. They don't just want to take the cubs. They want to hire you as their lead cheetah specialist. It's a paid position, housing included. And you could bring the baby to visit. Spain to Montana is much closer than Kenya to Montana." Thomas's mind reeled. A grandchild, a job, a future he hadn't imagined could exist. "But Emma needs me in Montana." "Does she?" Patricia interrupted gently. "Or does she need to know you're alive, engaged, doing meaningful work? A grandfather who's given up is no use to a child. A grandfather with purpose, saving cheetahs, continuing their father's conservation dreams, that's a legacy." That evening, Thomas sat alone with the cubs, his mind churning through possibilities. The satellite phone lay beside him with Emma's number, provided by Sarah. He'd tried to call 3 times but couldn't make his fingers complete the sequence. It was Hope who broke through his paralysis. She was practicing her hunting crouch, stalking a beetle with intense concentration, when she suddenly stopped and looked directly at him. The intelligence in her young eyes was unmistakable. She chirped the exact sound Grace had made that impossible night, the sound that had seemed to say, "Tommy." And suddenly, with crystalline clarity, Thomas remembered James's actual last words. Not the panicked "Dad" that haunted his nightmares, but the conversation from the night before the climb. They'd been looking at James's photography portfolio, planning his application to National Geographic. "Dad," James had said, pointing to a photo of orphaned wolves. "If something ever happens to me, promise me something. Nothing's going to happen. Just promise. Help them. The animals. They need voices, advocates. If I can't do it, you do it. Help them." Thomas had laughed it off, made some joke about James outliving him by decades. But now, sitting in the African dust with two orphaned cubs whose mother had inexplicably trusted him, the words took on prophetic weight. Help them. Not help me. Never help me. James had always been looking outward, toward the vulnerable, the voiceless. Even his fatal climb had been about documenting mountain goats losing habitat to climate change. Thomas picked up the phone and dialed Emma's number. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting by the phone for weeks. "Mr. Mitchell?" Her voice was young, scared, hopeful. "Emma," Thomas said, his voice rough. "Tell me about my grandchild." The conversation that followed broke and rebuilt him simultaneously. Emma was 26, a wilderness photographer James had been mentoring. They'd fallen in love over discussions of conservation, had planned to marry after her graduation. The baby was due in 2 months, a boy they'd already decided to name Thomas James Mitchell, though James had never gotten to tell his father about either the relationship or the pregnancy. "He was going to tell you after that climb," Emma said through tears. "He wanted to get one spectacular photo to show you he was serious about conservation photography. He said you'd understand commitment to animals better than commitment to a person." Thomas laughed through his own tears. It was so perfectly James, trying to prove himself when he'd never needed to prove anything. "Emma, I'm in Kenya with 2 orphaned cheetah cubs. There's a position in Spain where I could continue caring for them. Do conservation work. Would you and little Thomas ever consider visiting maybe regularly?" "Mr. Mitchell Thomas, I would bring him anywhere to know his grandfather. James always said you were his hero. I want our son to know why." After the call, Thomas sat in the darkness, processing the truth that had been revealed. He'd come to Kenya to die, but every step had been guided toward life. Grace hadn't randomly appeared. She'd been exactly where he needed to find her. The cubs weren't just orphans. They were his connection to a future he'd thought was lost. Patricia found him there an hour later, the cubs asleep in his lap. "The documentation you've created could fund cheetah conservation for years," she said. "Combined with your veterinary skills and the obvious bond you have with these cubs, you could save dozens, maybe hundreds of cheetahs. Is that something that interests you?" Thomas looked at the stars, the same ones that had watched Grace die, but now they seemed less like witnesses to ending and more like guides to beginning. "My son's last words to me were, 'Help them.' He meant animals. I thought I'd failed him by not being there when he died, but maybe I'd fail him worse by not being here now, for them. So you'll take the position." "I'll take the position. I'll sell the Montana house, set up a trust for my grandchild, and spend whatever years I have left honoring the chain of sacrifice James for the animals he loved. Eleanor for me, Grace for her cubs, all of them trusting that life would continue, that love would find new vessels." The cubs stirred in their sleep, Hope's paw twitching as she dreamed of hunting, Chance purring that impossible purr she'd inherited from her mother. They were so small still, so vulnerable, but also so fierce with life force. Thomas had been wrong in his suicide note. He hadn't had nothing left to give. He'd had everything to give, he just needed the right recipients. And they'd found him, or been sent to him, or however the universe arranged such things. A dying cheetah with James's eyes had saved him so he could save her cubs and maybe, in doing so, save himself enough to be the grandfather his son's child deserved. The revelation was complete. This hadn't been about ending at all. It had always been about transformation, about love shape-shifting into new forms but never truly dying. Grace had known it. Eleanor had known it. James had known it. Now Thomas knew it too. 5 years had transformed the Valencia Wildlife Sanctuary into something extraordinary. Thomas Mitchell stood at the observation platform, watching the morning sun paint the Spanish countryside gold, a color that always reminded him of African Savanna, below, in the vast semi-wild enclosure. Hope moved through the tall grass with lethal grace, her cubs tumbling behind her in playful pursuit. Abuelo, 4-year-old Thomas James Mitchell, TJ, as everyone called him, tugged at Thomas's sleeve. Is that Jamie, the baby you named after Daddy? Thomas lifted his grandson onto his shoulders, the boy's weight familiar and precious. That's right, buddy. Jamie's the fastest. Just like your dad was the fastest climber. Emma stood beside them, her camera clicking softly as she documented what she called the Mitchell Pride, 3 generations bound by love and loss and fierce devotion to life. She'd moved to Spain 2 years ago, taking a position with National Geographic that allowed her to document the sanctuary's groundbreaking work. Hope's teaching them to hunt, Emma observed, watching the mother cheetah demonstrate stalking techniques to her cubs, just like Grace taught her. It still amazed Thomas Hope had been barely 3 months old when Grace died. Yet she exhibited maternal behaviors that seemed directly inherited from those desperate days in Kenya. She was patient, strategic, fiercely protective. Her sister Chance had produced 2 litters of her own, all thriving, making the Valencia Sanctuary one of the most successful cheetah breeding programs in the world. Dr. Mitchell, a voice called from below. Maria, his assistant, waved from the medical facility. The documentary crew is here. The BBC was filming the final segment of The Cheetah Whisperer, a documentary about Thomas's revolutionary protocols for hand-rearing orphaned cubs while maintaining their wild instincts. The Mitchell method had saved 47 cubs across 6 countries, each one successfully integrated into breeding programs or, in 2 miraculous cases, released back to the wild. As Thomas headed down with TJ still on his shoulders, his phone buzzed. Bobby Hayes, calling from Texas. The rancher had become the sanctuary's largest donor after his wife dragged him to see the documentary's first episode. Doc, Bobby's gruff voice carried clearly. Just wired another 100,000. That new enclosure better have my name on it. It'll say the Robert Hayes Conservation Complex, Thomas assured him. Thank you, Bobby. Don't thank me. Thank that damn cheetah that changed your life. Changed mine too, I suppose. Made me realize some things are bigger than cattle prices. The film crew captured Thomas entering Hope's enclosure, something that still made visitors gasp. But Hope knew him, trusted him, allowed him near her cubs just as Grace had. The parallel wasn't lost on anyone who knew the story. Tell us about the moment you realized Grace had saved you, the interviewer prompted. Thomas considered, his hand resting on Hope's head as she purred that impossible purr that genetics said shouldn't exist but did anyway. It wasn't a moment. It was the accumulation. Every day those cubs needed me was a day I couldn't quit. Every milestone they reached was proof that broken things could become whole again. Just different. TJ had wandered over to where Chance rested in the shade, the child showing no fear, only the respectful approach Thomas had taught him. This was James's dream realized, humans and wildlife coexisting, understanding each other, protecting each other. That evening, after the crew left and TJ was asleep in the cottage they all shared, Thomas walked alone to the memorial garden. He'd planted an acacia tree for Grace, surrounded by Montana wildflowers for Eleanor and James. He pulled out a worn letter, one he'd written but never sent. Dear Eleanor, he read aloud to the Spanish stars. Our son had a son. He has your smile and James's eyes and my stubbornness. He speaks 3 languages: English, Spanish, and what he calls cheetah. He's fearless and gentle, wild and wise. You would be so proud. I found our purpose, El. Not the one we planned, but the one that found us through tragedy. I save cheetahs. I teach others to save them. I'm living the life James dreamed of, honoring him with every cub that survives, every mother that thrives. Grace, you never met her, but somehow I think you sent her taught me that love doesn't die. It just changes form, from parent to child, from human to animal, from past to future. The cubs she died to save have cubs of their own now. The chain continues. I'm not just surviving anymore, El. I'm living, really living. For you, for James, for Grace, for TJ. For every cheetah that needs saving. Sometimes we must lose everything to discover we still have something to give. And in that giving, we don't just find ourselves, we find our forever. He folded the letter, placed it at the base of the acacia tree where it would decompose, feed the soil, become part of the endless cycle Grace had taught him to accept. A sound made him turn. Hope had somehow escaped her enclosure. She was clever that way, and stood at the garden's edge, her golden eyes catching moonlight. She chirped once, that specific sound Grace had made. Impossible but real. "I know," Thomas whispered. "I'm okay. We're all okay." Hope turned and padded back toward her cubs, her family, her future. Thomas followed, heading home to his grandson, his daughter-in-law, his unexpected family. Behind them, the stars witnessed not an ending but a continuation, love transcending death, purpose born from pain, hope rising from ashes. The cheetah who'd died on the African savanna had saved more than cubs. She'd saved a man, who saved her cubs, who saved other cubs, who would save cubs not yet born. The circle expanded endlessly, Grace's sacrifice rippling through time, species, continents. Thomas Mitchell had come to Kenya to end his story. Instead, he'd discovered stories never truly end, they just transform, passed from one heart to another, one generation to the next, as eternal as the stars, as persistent as a mother's love, as miraculous as the trust between a dying cheetah and a broken man who found each other exactly when they needed to most. You know, friend. As I share Thomas's story with you, I find myself thinking about my own losses, my own moments when the weight of grief felt unbearable. We all carry these broken places inside us, don't we? The empty chairs at holiday dinners, the phone numbers we can't bring ourselves to delete, the dreams that died with the people we loved. But here's what Grace taught me through Thomas's journey. Sometimes the universe sends us exactly what we need, disguised as something else entirely. A dying cheetah becomes a reason to live. Orphaned cubs become teachers of resilience. The family we lose transforms into the family we find. Different but no less real. I used to think gratitude meant being thankful for what we have. Now I understand it means being thankful for what remains after loss, for what grows in the spaces grief carved out. Family isn't just blood or species, it's whoever shows up when you're broken, whoever trusts you with their young, whoever sees your pain and says, "I'll stay." Thomas thought he had nothing left to give. He discovered that even empty hands can hold hope, that even broken hearts can nurture new life. That's the gift I want to leave with you. You're never as alone or as finished as you think you are.